Hello again, it's me. And today let's delve into a strange ghost story that happened over 2 decades ago during my first year at Clear Channel in Shreveport, Louisiana. I was in my early 20s, working part-time as a board operator and promotions assistant for several radio stations in our building. I also worked overnight on weekends as a disc jockey for Rocka 99, known as 99X FM. One of the annual events our cluster of stations participated in was the Fortia at Cross Lake in the early summer of 2002. It was a memory I would never forget. This happened to me over 2 decades ago, during my first year in radio at Clear Channel, Shreveport, and Louisiana. I was in my early 20s working part-time as a board operator and promotions assistant for several stations in our building, as well as doing overnights on the weekends as a disc jockey for the radio station, Rocka 99, which is also known as 99X FM. One of the annual events that our cluster of stations would participate in was the Fortilla at Cross Lake. In the early summer of 2002, our rock station had an on-air sponsorship deal with a local boat dealership, which allowed us to borrow two of their boats, a party barge and a motor-powered bass boat, which would be used during this event. It was a near-perfect Saturday to be on the water. The sun was out, and it was also fairly windy. The boats were floating and zooming all over Cross Lake that day. This, combined with the wind, led to there being more wave activity on the lake than usual. Around a half a dozen of us were on the party barge, with at least two others riding around on the bass boat. One of the DJ's wives in attendance was wearing a brown straw hat to protect herself from the sun. While the party barge was in the middle of the lake, a gust of wind caught her hat and tossed it into the water. We stopped the barge and attempted to retrieve the hat, but it was too far away for any of us to reach. In the spur of the moment, I made a decision that would nearly result in me becoming a permanent resident of Cross Lake. Without giving it a second thought, I took off my shirt, removed my shoes, and dove into the water without wearing a life jacket. Swimming to the hat was the easy part, but my sense of accomplishment would soon be replaced by absolute fear and helplessness. The barge was only a few feet away from me, and on a calm day, I could have easily swam back to it. But the waves from all the boats on Cross Lake, as well as the wind, prevented me from returning to the barge, no matter how hard I tried. I quickly gave up on retrieving the hat, because now I was fighting just to stay alive. It's a very unique kind of terror when you find yourself thrashing around the open water, knowing that if you stop, you'll die. Everyone on the party barge thought I was messing around at first and were having a good laugh, but it soon became apparent that the waves kept knocking me back despite my best efforts to reach the barge. Our program director, who would eventually become one of my best friends, tried throwing a life preserver toward me, but the wind caught it and it landed out of my reach. The small glimmer of hope I had was snatched away from me. They tried moving the barge closer to me, but it wasn't designed to be maneuvered in that way. Plus, whoever was driving it at the time wasn't exactly an expert. Once it became apparent that I couldn't swim back, I focused all of my remaining energy into kicking, in the hopes of keeping my head above water. Fortunately, we did have cell phones back then, and my program director was able to get in touch with the other boat. The only problem was, they were on the other side of the lake, which meant I had to stay above water long enough for them to arrive. And at this point, I was running out of time. Those few minutes of kicking just to keep myself from drowning felt like hours, and for the first time, I was truly afraid of dying. I know this sounds crazy, but I could almost feel death's cold embrace. When you're a teenager or a young adult like I was at the time, you feel like your whole life is ahead of you, chapters of your life yet to be written, never considering the whole book could be slammed shut before the story is even finished, over a straw hat of all things. The bass boat finally arrived before I lost all the strength in my body. The driver of the boat was another DJ who managed to pull me out of the water. Laying on the floor of that boat, with the sun on my face, was an amazing feeling. I was wet, tired, and my entire body was sore. I had barely survived this ordeal, and was now a much wiser man. Nothing makes you feel more grateful to be alive than a near-death experience. Anytime I ever go back into the water, whether it's a lake, river, or the ocean, I always wear a life jacket. On a final note, fate certainly does have a thing for irony. The husband of the woman, whose hat I was trying to save, was the one who ended up saving me from literally sleeping with the fishes. This is one of the creepiest, unexplained experiences that has ever happened to me. Thinking back on it now, I still get this unnerving feeling that lingers. Anyways, here we go. A group of friends and I, all in our mid-20s, rented out this place on the lake for a fun-filled weekend of drinking and partying. From Friday night to Saturday morning, we pretty much went all out, having a blast on the lake. By the time Saturday afternoon came around, we were all so hungover from the night before, we decided that on this night, there would be no drinking. Maybe a bit of smoking, but that's it. We would just have a chill night and relax. 9 p.m. rolls around. Some of us were inside the lake house, and there was about 5 of us outside. The second floor of the lake house had a deck that overlooked the surrounding forest. You couldn't see the lake from there, but it was within walking distance. I'll mention that we had already had some weird vibes from the locals when we first arrived in town. Mostly just backcountry folk, who I assumed were a bit irritated because a bunch of out-of-towners were coming there looking for a good time. But between the town and the lake was such a large area that realistically, it wouldn't be close enough to anyone to be a bother. Anyways, 3 of the group are on the upstairs deck, my brother being one of them, while I was talking to a friend on a small wooden table just outside the forest. It was a very peaceful night, when suddenly, an unnerving feeling overcame us. It was so distracting that my friend and I stopped talking and just stared into the dark forest. Soon we heard a loud, eerie chanting. I have no idea how far away it was, but it sounded like the chanting was being carried through the forest. All the voices were male. They were loud and perfectly in sync. We were both frozen for at least 20 seconds before I could no longer contain myself and got up and darted toward the house, with my friend following me. I don't know how to explain the feeling that came with the chanting, but it felt almost evil. I was shaking by the time we got up to the second-story deck and joined the others. By the time we got there, the chanting had ceased. Did you guys hear that? Before anyone could even respond, the chanting began again. The 5 of us were now peering into the forest, listening to this bizarre chanting. It would sometimes sound very far away, and then relatively close. We couldn't make out what they were saying. It may have been in another language. A loud bang rang out, like someone had hit a huge metal object. What followed that was the scariest part. A man began wailing in extreme pain. All of my hair was now standing up. It was the most vomit-inducing thing I've heard. My brother and I were now staring at each other in a mixture of astonishment and disgust. The wailing stopped, and the chanting began again. After the chanting died down, one of our friends said that it was a bunch of drunk guys in the forest trying to scare us. But there was no way that chanting was coming from a bunch of drunk guys. All the voices were perfectly in sync, and that wail sounded like someone was being tortured. Plus, there was all that tension we felt. Something extremely messed up was taking place somewhere in that forest. It definitely wasn't in our immediate proximity, but close enough to where we could hear it perfectly. I remember that one of our group suggesting that we go explore and find out what was going on. But obviously, the rest of us thought that was a very stupid idea. I regret to say that we didn't call the cops. Looking back, I wish we would have. But the forest around that lake was so massive, it could have been from anywhere. I was very relieved to say the least when we were driving out of there the next morning. Thinking back to that night, it still gives me the worst kind of feeling. Whatever was going on, it just felt so wrong and evil. So this story is going to be pretty deep, and it will sound unbelievable, but I will provide some articles to corroborate everything. It all began in the summer of 2021. I was working as a lifeguard at a small beach called Adams Point Beach, located off Quincy Lake, New York. I didn't really enjoy my job a whole lot, to be honest. It was just a way of making ends meet. But I did make friends with some of the other lifeguards, so I guess that was a plus. To make matters even more difficult, I lived in a house off the lake with my parents, who would fight with each other almost every night. It was a very toxic environment to be in, and at one point I was working 2 jobs just to stay away from that place. A year after being hired, my boss had demoted me to a sub-lifeguard. It gave me some bullshit reason for doing this, but it pissed me off because I could no longer work with my friends. Fast forward to August of 2022. I was called in to cover for another lifeguard who had to call out. Usually there were 3 lifeguards working this shift, but on that day, there was a staff shortage. The shift began as normal. I would spend 30 minutes in the lifeguard chair before being swapped out. About 10 minutes later, while I was on my phone in a rec room, I heard a bunch of commotion coming from outside. There was screaming. I didn't know what was going on, so I rushed outside. What I saw is something I'll never be able to unsee. The lifeguard, along with 4 other people, had a woman on a rescue board. One of her legs was horribly wounded. I mean, it was nearly gone. I almost vomited at the sight. But I had to help out the other lifeguard. It was my job. I helped carry the board, but I had to keep my head turned, as it was too brutal to look at directly. I helped place the board on a table next to a shed. Thankfully, the police had already been called and arrived shortly after. The woman ended up being airlifted to the hospital by helicopter. During the aftermath, I asked one of the beachgoers what happened, and he said, there was someone on a speedboat that wasn't looking where he was driving. People told him to slow down, but he didn't listen. After he ran over that poor woman, he stopped his boat, and then he just took off again. I could not believe what I was hearing. I then asked the man to describe what the boat looked like, because I pretty much know who comes out to this lake and who lives around here. He said it was one of those blue jet boats. When he told me this, I felt as if my entire world was coming to an end. There was only one person that I knew Who owned that kind of boat? My own father. Everything went blurry, and then it all went black. I woke up to two people beside me, asking me if I was all right. Yeah, I'm fine. I've just never seen somebody's leg like that. Excuse me, I just need to go get a drink of water. My boss arrived a short time later and told everyone to go home because of what happened. I got my car and made the 5-minute drive back to my place. When I got there, I saw my dad pacing back and forth nervously through the kitchen window. It did cross my mind to turn him in, but I was just so scatterbrained in the moment that I rushed inside the house and went into a full rampage on him. You hit that poor woman on the lake and just ran away? You fucking coward. He couldn't even look at me as I yelled at him. My adrenaline was now going into hyperdrive. I just couldn't contain myself, so I shoved him and then started hitting him. After hitting him about 10 times, I had finally pushed him to his limits, and he hit me so hard I fell to the ground, and my ears were ringing. I don't care what I did. You do not put your hands on me, ever. Now stay down. He then ran out of the house and took off somewhere. I sat there bawling my eyes out. As I alluded to at the beginning of this story, I didn't have the best relationship with my father, but this was a whole new low for him. We weren't close, but never in a million years would I have thought he would end up doing something like this. Now, I don't know all the details, but no criminal charges were ever filed against him. I'm not sure how he weaseled out of it, but there was never an arrest, a trial, or a media circus. If I had to guess, it was ruled an accident, and the woman and my father came to some kind of civil agreement. I remember my mom coming back from the hospital one day. She went to go check on that woman and told me that she was alive and well, but that her damaged leg had to be amputated. I felt so relieved that she survived, but I was also devastated that my own father was responsible for this. We never saw him again after that night. He not only fled the scene of the accident, but he also abandoned his marriage as well. It goes without saying that there was a lot of other things that were going on that I'm not willing to get into, but the boating accident was the straw that broke the camel's back. I quit my job as a lifeguard shortly after this incident. It was causing me a lot of trauma. I even began having nightmares over it. It got so bad that I had to go see a psychologist at least 3 times a week. Each day I'm slowly getting better and better, and I still have a long way to go. I wish I could tell you the story ends here. However, what happened at the lake and my father leaving us aren't the only reasons I'm in therapy. Let's move the timeline to mid-July of this year. I am still living with my mom out on Quincy Lake. My dad has been gone for some time now, and we were moving on with our lives. I needed some time to myself that day, and I decided to go kayaking around 7 p.m. I paddled to a shallow area of the lake. I planned on stopping at the beach area for a while to give my arms a rest before heading back. While approaching the beachhead, I kept looking at the water just beneath my kayak. Something was off. It was getting dark out by this point. I had a mounted light on the kayak, but since I knew the way by heart, I didn't want to waste the battery on it just yet. My paddle then hit something in the water. At first, I thought it was a rock, which I thought was very strange, because I knew this area of the lake very well, and I wasn't anywhere near where the rocks usually were. So I pulled out my flashlight, turned it on, and looked. I shit you not. I saw the body of an old woman floating in the water. I let out the most ear-piercing shriek you've ever heard in your life. I quickly paddled out of there, reaching the shore a short time later. After pulling my kayak to shore, I ran to the grass area and threw up about 5 times, Luckily, I had my cell phone on me, so I immediately called 911. About 7 cop cars showed up 10 minutes later. The body was of a 71-year-old woman from New Lebanon. They estimated that she had been out there for about 4 hours before I discovered her. In the news reports that I've read, the articles state that a lifeguard discovered her body. I never spoke to a reporter after giving my statement to the police, but I assume they're referring to me. But I was no longer a lifeguard at that point. It's been a rough few years for me. I was hoping after the pandemic our family could turn things around, but between the boating accident, my father leaving, and the dead woman in the lake, I'd say things aren't going too well. My mother and I still live in the same house on Quincy Lake, but I'm hoping that someday, the both of us can move on and leave all these horrible memories behind. I would say things aren't going too well. My mother and I still live in the same house by Quiney Lake, but I hope that someday we can move on and leave all these horrible memories behind. No matter what, there's always a reason to be afraid. That's it for today's video. What do you think about this story? Feel free to share your theories in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching. For now, goodbye and see you next time.